So in this system you have no protection. The result is that ordinary people, that is 80–90% of the population, hate the law. They don't feel it's anything to do with them. It is part of that powerful, horrible government which is constantly attacking you, taxing you, marauding with its armies across you. So there are many prayers in many of the local parts of Europe saying, please God, defend us from plagues, diseases, famines, and the law. Now, it's important to remind you and tell people of this because, of course, now, since the Second World War, much of this has changed. Now, most European law actually has taken Anglo-American law, and so you have many protections and rights and so on and so on. So the situation is totally different now. But historically, up till very recently, this was the situation. So law was very important, but also backing up a system of hierarchies. The next question I want to look at is, why did Europe hit a high-level equilibrium trap? Now, if you remember yesterday, I posed the famous Needham question, which is, why did China thank you. Why did China go like this, like that, now that? That's the Needham problem. What happened in the Sung after the Sung? Many people who compare Europe and the West think this is a Chinese problem. But if you look at Europe, not in terms of science and knowledge, but also in terms of that, Europe does exactly the same thing. That is to say, if you look at the period, say, from the 12th century to the 16th century, Europe grows, its economy grows, its knowledge grows. You have the great period of the Renaissance, scientific revolution, Italy, Spain, very rich. And then it goes like this. And if you look at Europe, say in 1800, it has not progressed at all. This was observed by the great Scottish philosopher and founder of economics, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, he said that if you look at the economies, he was writing about here, 1786, and he said if you look at the economies of France, Italy, Spain, all this area here, you will find that they grew fast until this time. But now they are, some of them are just about the same, and many of them are declining. But Italy, Spain are less rich now than they were 200 years ago. There has been no continuous development. And it doesn't just apply to the economy, which of course had huge implications. It meant that French peasants in the middle of the 18th century were poorer, working harder, had less animals, less machines than they had 200 years earlier. They were beginning to decline. Europe was beginning to decline in the 18th century. But it was declining in many other ways too. The scientific revolution, which had started to a great extent in Italy, by the end of the 17th century there was no science in Italy. Gone. After Galileo and the great period, gone. The arts, Renaissance, the great flourishing period of the Italian, Dutch Renaissance is over by the end of the 17th century. The universities, the great universities of Seville and Bologna and Paris and all the universities of Europe, which had been great and flourishing places for free thought and ideas in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, by the time of the middle of the 18th century, the time of the great rulers like Louis XIV, they were gone. They were just empty. Not much was happening at all. And politically, Europe had gone dead too. The great period of the republics of Venice, Florence, Siena, the periods of flourishing republican, the power of cities, and so on, all over Europe. By the middle of the 18th century, Europe was ruled by dictators in Germany, in France, in Russia, Peter the Great. It had turned towards the right, and it was culturally and economically declining. This is very important for you to realize, because often you will encounter people who will say, well, why did China give up? Why did it stop after the Song? And your answer should be saying, well, this is normal. This is exactly what happened to your continent too. Happened in Europe. It's what happens when you are living off agriculture. The power from the sun. Yes, if you can ask them possibly to start. Seems to be my fate that wherever I go, someone decides to start drilling. That might help. What I have to do is stop for 30 minutes. So the normal state is stasis. The thing we need to explain is the extraordinary events that led to our modern world, which I'll be talking about this afternoon. What happened, in fact, can be put in another way. Is that there is one of the great histories of Europe was by a Frenchman called Guizot. He was the teacher of de Tocqueville, and he had the theory that the dynamism, the secret of European success for 500 years was that you have 4 different groups. You have the nobility, powerful nobles. You have the king. You have the traders and bourgeoisie. And you have the clergy, the religious people. The peasants are down here. And for 500 years after the fall, or 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, all these groups became more or less equal. So you had big, powerful cities, You had a powerful church, you had a quite powerful king, and you had a powerful nobility. And they often, the nobility and the bourgeois would form one group, the king and the clergy would form another group. And they were more or less balanced. So no one could dominate. The king could not become too powerful, and the nobles, and so on. And for about 500 years, from about the 11th, 12th centuries through to the 17th century, there was a balance of power, which gave the dynamism and the freedom and the ability to flourish. Then from about the 17th century, it all got unbalanced. This side became more and more powerful through the, as I was mentioning, Roman law and so on. They became weaker, and they became weaker. And Europe headed towards dictatorship and towards powerful monarchies. Why this is, I think, important to understand as a deep history of Europe is that this tendency to become, or the centre to become very powerful, has recurred again and again. It happened under Louis XIV and Peter the Great and so on in the 18th century. Then Napoleon came and broke it apart. Napoleon, of course, is the last representative of this dictator who tried to rule the whole of Europe. But when he fell, Europe split into less powerful nations again. But the extraordinary fact that when I was born, when Sarah was born, Europe, the whole of this area, when I was born, was a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, ruled by Mussolini, Hitler, and over here by Stalin. Franco down here. Salazar. So all this, it's easy. If people start talking to you about why doesn't China become democratic, all you need to say is, well, when did you become democratic? About 60 years ago, sort of. So it's very recent democracy in America, in Europe. It's only 60 years old. This was a huge dictatorship over the whole of Europe when we were born. So this swing to the right has happened several times in Europe and is not abnormal. What had happened is that in both China and Europe, you'd hit high-level equilibrium. The economic cause is simple, which was known to Alan Smith, which is that if you just take your energy from the sun and put it through animals and plants, it's very, very inefficient, and you can only get 0.01% or something of the energy of the sun to live off. So the Earth by that time was as full as it could be. It was 500 million people. It was a third of the size of China now, more or less. But it was full from using this power source. What, of course, changed the world, and I'll talk about this afternoon, is when you suddenly release all the stored energy of the sun through oil and coal, fossil fuels. But until you can do that and use machines, human beings could not really live much better. So that when one of the greatest historians, called Gibbon, in his great work on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, when he looked around him, he said, in a world which was 500 million, 750 million people, 500,000 people, he says, I see around me a world in which 3/4 of the human beings on it live in misery and poverty and destitution. 3/4 of the world lived more or less just about living, surviving. Any bad event and they would drown. That was the world by the middle of the 18th century. And Adam Smith, when he compared Europe and China, said that actually China has done better than Europe, that Europe has went like this and then is beginning to decline. And he's here. He said China has done this and is more or less constant. If you look at China in his time, he says it's a thriving place, cities filled with people, bustling. They're doing pretty well, better than us in many ways. Now, are you very tired? Do you need a rest? We're going to stop in 20 minutes. Would you like to have 3 minutes rest, or shall I go on?
Go on, please.
Okay. Let's look at some of the outstanding features of the contrast between China and Europe. One of them is very easy to see from that map, and also a map of I'll draw it of China. So roughly this is China here, this is the sea here, and then you've got other countries here. And China by the Qing is huge and like that. If you look at that, and then you look at this, you see that Europe is a sea civilization. It's a water civilization. But the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Baltic, Black Sea, it means that there are very few places in Western Europe until you get into the middle of France or the middle of Spain. There are very few places which are far from the sea. So you can do a lot of trade along those routes. And also it's a strange characteristic that if you look at sea ports, whether you look at Bordeaux and French ports, or Venice and Italian ports, or London and Glasgow, English and Scottish ports, these are places which are usually very free, Amsterdam and Antwerp. Somehow being bordering on the sea brings in new ideas and gives you a chance to be independent. The great dictatorships and empires tend to be in these great large land masses, whereas there is different character to this. It also has the huge effect that looking towards the sea and constantly evolving shipping and boating meant that Europe tended to look outwards, so that when the opportunity came to explore towards what they thought was China and turned out to be America, or round with Cape Good Hope to India, the Europeans had been a seafaring nation for a long time, the Vikings, the British, and so they took to the sea, and their seaborne empires, the British was a seaborne empire, and so were the Spanish and so on, and the Dutch. Whereas China, you have obviously a coastal strip here, which has strong links along the southern Silk Road to Asia like that. But most of China looks westwards, along the Silk Road here, and huge parts of China, like Chengdu, are very, very, very far from the sea. You are a landed civilization. Europe is a water-landed civilization. Another great difference is in the cities. I touched on this briefly, but I'll just reiterate. Rome was an urban, that is a city-based civilization. The Romans, wherever they went, made great cities. Even in England, they made Bath and Rome, London, and so on. Certainly in Italy, the Romans started in Rome, and their whole civilization was based on Rome, Alexandria, and other cities. So, for the Romans, the city shapes almost everything. So that when Roman civilization re-emerged in the 12th, 13th century, the idea of everything being centered on the city was very, very powerful. Civility, civilization, the very words mean city, kivis. So to be not barbaric and simple people, but to be civilized means to be a city dweller. The distinction rose, or a distinction between us as cultured people and the people who live out in the fields and who are just peasants, as being more natural, but being more simple and barbaric. We inhabit a high culture. We are literate, we write, we go to universities, we can manipulate figures, we have a higher form of religion. They are just peasants living out there. I actually came across this, and it was brought home to me once when I was visited by a famous French journalist who had formerly been a student of mine. He came to visit me in my little thatched cottage in the countryside, which is 5 miles outside Cambridge. And he came out in his car to see me, to interview me. And he was part of a famous intellectual family, Todd, Emmanuel Todd, who's written about European families. And he came into my little peasant house, thatched house out in the country. He said, "How can you live out in this peasant village? Pigs and animals, and all nature and dirty and backward, you know. You could never do this in France. We French intellectuals, we live in Paris. We live on the left bank in Paris, in a high-rise flat. This is civilized. We go and drink coffee in the local cafe, and we have highbrow conversations about Foucault and things like that. You peasant, you're just a peasant living out in the village." So I suddenly realized the difference of civilizations. The top professionals and rulers lived in cities across Europe. And this is totally different. So a city, particularly as Max Weber, who wrote a great book on cities, as you go further north, cities become more and more powerful and independent. So a city in Europe is, first it's bounded by perhaps a wall, but it is an economic unit. It has a special kind of market inside it, which is different from the markets outside. It is a political unit. It has its own government. It is probably a religious unit. It has its own large churches. And it is a cultural unit. It has its own special mentality and morality. There's been quite a lot of work by German sociologists and others about urbanism as a way of life. In a city, time is different. It rushes much more quickly. Space is different. Clothing is different. Accents are different. So this is Europe. This part of Europe was a set of oases of cities in the middle of a peasant civilization. Vast opposition between the two. Now, China, historically, and that is not totally dissimilar from Japan, as I mentioned. China, as a civilization, was totally different. You had your large cities. You had Beijing or Nanjing or Suzhou or Chengdu. But they were hollow. There was nothing there. You had a huge, great wall with gates in it, so it could be protected, and the status of the rulers was shown by the vast size of the walls. But apart from that, it was nothing. You know, the peasants came in and they sold their things there, and the people here went outside. The people outside were the same as the people inside. No special political system, no special religious system, no special cultural system, or social system. The only thing that was different was that you might have a small group of soldiers there, the imperial soldiers and guards, the mandarins, residents. Otherwise, nothing. I mean,
They have market.
Skinner, who wrote the famous article, who talks about Chinese marketing systems. I'm not sure he actually noticed this. The Skinner's model, which is based partly around here, as you know, is of a large market with satellite smaller markets, each of which has smaller markets of it. So Chengdu, and then Fujian, and then villages of Fujian. This is a permanent place where you can sell, and quite a high scale, and you have large and expensive things being sold here. This is maybe every week market, and these are perhaps every month. And at each level you sell different things. But otherwise, they're no different. It's just the scale is different, but the quality of the feeling of the place is no different. Now that's totally different from Rome or Amsterdam or European cities. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference of family systems between Europe and China. There is a huge difference. You, as I tried to explain, have a system where you trace your ancestors through males. We in Europe trace our ancestors through both males and females. We have a bilateral system. So we don't form into any kind of clans, as I mentioned. There is no Harrison clan. My wife is English. There is a Macfarlane clan because I'm Scottish, but there's no Harrison clan. They don't have any ancestors. They don't have an ancestor hall. They don't gather together. They don't have a special tartan which they can wear and fight against other Harrisons or other clans. So kinship is much more important in China than in Europe. There are no named strong blood groups of kin, except in one or two areas of Europe. There are exceptions. One very important one is here in the Balkans, in Montenegro and Albania, and that sort of area. It's a very mountainous region, and for that reason, and because it's on the edge of various empires, between empires, the family there is very, very different. It's an extraordinary area which historically has been more like northeast India. They had blood feuds, feuding, fighting against other groups. They have blood vengeance. They have vendettas. They even had headhunting at one time. They would go and attack another village and cut off their heads and bring them back, like the Nagas. So this area, the Balkans, was also my area up in Scotland, northern Scotland, had something like a clan system. But it was different. In both those cases, they still traced their ancestors through both males and females, but somehow they worked out, I won't go into the details, but they worked out a system of making blood-based groups. There are minorities, of course. The gypsies have much stronger kinship than the average population. And of course, immigrants nowadays have different family systems. So there is a huge difference between the majority of Europe and China in terms of family and the importance of the family. On the other hand, there is one overwhelming similarity, which is that in China, you were born into a family and your relations with your parents and your wider family is never broken. In the Confucian system, you owe respect and honour and duty to support your parents as they do to you. You are one, you're bonded with your parents in the Chinese system. And to a considerable extent, this whole area here of continental Europe has a weaker version, but a similar version to that. As I said, it becomes more powerful as you get further south. At the north, northern France, northern Germany, it's not so strong, but southern France, Italy, Spain, you are very, very close to your parents and you never break that link. So, in some ways, continental Europe and southern continental Europe is quite similar in feeling to China. And this is linked to the educational systems. In the Chinese educational system, what you do is you leave your house, this is traditional education system, and you go into a school and you are filled with material, which still happens to Paul Sherry and others. You just go into the school and you work. And then you come home to your real family and your emotions and your ethical and other life. And that is the same in the schooling systems of this area. In other words, the school is an intellectual place. In a French school, you go in through the gates, sit there, scribble, do nothing else, and then you go home, traditionally. And it's still largely the case. They are dealing with your brain. As we'll see when we get to England this afternoon, in America, our schools are totally different. They are society. They are to take you out of the home and break your link with your family. So the continental schooling and the Chinese schooling doesn't break the family. It allows the family to go on holding you. So, to summarize that, the Chinese and the Europeans, you have a similarity. If you go to Italy or Spain, you will feel some affinity with the people there because they live, as you do, in what anthropologists call an embedded civilization. That means that you are within it, you are not separated out. You live within the close social, emotional ties of a family, and you are not disembedded from it. You and the continental Europeans live in a hierarchical system, males superior to females to a certain extent, even now, but certainly in the past. The emperor superior to the subjects. And many Europeans live in that kind of hierarchical embedded system. That means that on the whole, historically, Europeans and Chinese have never been entirely free. We consider, and I'll talk about this afternoon, the concepts of freedom. We consider freedom the ability to separate yourself out from any other powerful, dominating force, whether it is politics, the market, or the family. You are still embedded within your families to a certain extent, as the Europeans are. If you define modernity in the modern world as one based on freedom of the kind that the Americans preach, then you are not modern yet, and nor are the French or the Germans. So there is a very famous book by a French anthropologist called Bruno Latour, and his best known book is called We Have Never Been Modern. Now, he's not exactly talking about what I'm talking about, but it overlaps with it. And it is true that to a certain extent, looked at from England or America, the French are not modern. They live in an older, embedded kind of civilization, which has not the absolute mobility and freedom that the Anglo-American era creates. This leads, at its extremes, to a situation where, if you want to understand this world, you have to use the same kind of methods that you use for China, which I was talking about. You have to use a structural method, because all the great structuralists, that is, the thinkers who have approached the world as if it not consists of separate items, but of relations, as I was talking in the first lecture, of relations and relations of relations. These structuralist thinkers, nearly all of them French, starts with Montesquieu, Tocqueville, Durkheim, Lévi-Strauss, Foucault, and so on. The whole tradition of structural thinking tends to come from France, Spain, Germany, and it arises out of a particular structural embedded civilization which you have in that area of the world. And so some of the best books about China tend to be written by Frenchmen. The best single author, I think, on China is a Frenchman called Grammy. His book on Chinese religion and his book on Chinese civilization grasps the essence of it because he understands it. Because there is some similarity of affinity. Now that way of thinking, which you have and the continental Europeans have, you are like distant cousins to these people. And this afternoon, I will tell you about how you are strangers to my civilization. So we will meet as strangers, but I hope end up as friends. Thank you. Of what I said, you think you understood. Starting at 100%, in other words, all, and then moving down. If you can put your hands up when you think it approximates to what percentage out of 10, so 100%, 90%, 80%, 70%. So I can just roughly guess how much of what I am saying you think you can probably understand. Okay? Over these 3 sessions. That will mean that in the last session I either make it more difficult or less difficult. Okay? So 100%, you think you understood more or less more everything I said. 90%, 1, 2, 3, I'm sure you could, couldn't you? 3, okay, that's encouraging. 80%, that's very encouraging. 70%? Let's go to 50, only half. Anyone could understand half or less? No.
With this help you can understand?
It's helpful,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Actually, I think we can understand every word, almost every word you said, but something behind that is difficult for us.
Yes. Well,
so this is very helpful.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, it's actually, you made an important distinction. You understood each word separately, and you even maybe understood each sentence as a sentence. But what I'm giving you is very high level, very difficult. If I was giving this to an English audience, my students, they would also really only understand 70–80% of what I'm saying. Because this is an unusual way of looking at things. It's opening up new subjects, thinking philosophically, analytically and comparatively in a way which most people are not familiar with. It calls on much background knowledge. So, for example, you don't know enough about the history, and when I mention a person's name, you don't immediately think of their theories or anything like that. So it's not surprising you find it difficult to move from the sentence to the ideas. But if you can get some of them, and if you can partially get some of them, and if it interests you and you can then follow up some of them, then it's sowing seeds. That's all I can do. I cannot give you the full meal or the full piece of grain. I can sow the seed. So as they say, I am giving you a fishing rod.
Yes.
But you have to go and catch the fish.
Yes.
Okay?
Okay, thank you.